Okay, so today we're going to talk about the use of economic sanctions as a tool for the United States to maintain its global hegemony. Economic sanctions are an area that I've done quite a bit of research in, including the creation of something called the Threatened Imposition of Sanctions Data, which is the acronym is the TIES data. So what I want to do today is to first go over some of the development in sanctions research and define what they are, and to give you an idea of what we believe makes sanctions more effective and makes them work, even though the common assumption is that sanctions don't work. And then what I want to do is to talk to you a little bit about how they work. So first part, let's focus on when they work and what are the identifiable conditions under which they do. So let me pull up the slides. Okay, so first let's think about why the United States may use sanctions and when do we see them. Now, again, from our previous discussions, what we know is that the United States has a considerable amount of power, a considerable amount of influence in global affairs. And we discussed several possible challenges to that hegemony in the form of terrorism, in the form of civil wars, and we've talked about how that may create refugee flows and some of the efforts by the United States to engage in peacekeeping as ways of trying to maintain the status quo and ways to try to minimize the damage of civil wars and potentially terrorism and refugee flows, which can be destabilizing. So the other part of maintaining hegemony, though, is not necessarily to use military force, it's instead to use economic power, right? And sometimes the challenges that the United States faces may not be territorial, right? They might not involve military force. They might involve other forms of behavior. So for example, it's fairly clear in recent years that Vladimir Putin has tried to challenge the Americans on several different dimensions. He's tried to challenge the Americans militarily in terms of territorial changes, but has also posed challenges to American influence, has tried to supply various adversaries to the United States with military weapons, etc. So for example, the United States in Libya, the official policy anyway, was to support something called the Government of National Accord, whereas the Russians have supported the leader in the eastern part of Libya. His name is Khalifa Haftar. So they supplied him with weapons, which is an effort to destabilize American foreign policy objectives in Libya, though those seem to have altered slightly in the Trump administration. But the point of this is that that's not necessarily a direct territorial challenge, right? Sometimes we see competition over markets. Sometimes we see competition over ideas. Sometimes we see competition over how to treat individuals and human rights and respect for democratic elections. And all of those different types of challenges may be things that the United States would like to respond to, but don't necessarily involve engaging in military force. So just as an example of this, one way that the United States can respond is through economic sanctions, is to not use military force, but to try to use the vast power of the American dollar and the vast power of the US economy to try to influence its adversaries and try to contain the influence of its adversaries. So just as an example of this, one famous sanctioning episode began in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution. Since that point, since the Iranians took control of the embassy and took hostages, the United States has imposed some form of sanctions on Iran, which have multiple purposes. One, it's just as an effort to try to contain Iran's behavior in the Middle East. Since the revolution of 1979, the Iranians have supported various movements throughout the Middle East, which are anti-status quo, which can be looked at as groups that are opposed to American interests, like Hezbollah, for example. The Houthis is an example of that, like Saudi Hezbollah, others, which are all groups that might oppose American interests. So imposing sanctions on them are a way to try to contain that behavior. Also, sanctions are a way to try to control Iran's ability to disrupt the Strait of Hormuz and deny them the military capability and weaken their ability to do that. So it checks Iran's behavior in the Middle East, it curtails their support for regional proxies. Also, since the mid-2000s, Iran has tried to trade oil in non-dollar denominations. So they've tried to accept the currencies for oil. And we talked earlier about how trade in energy for dollars is something that benefits the United States quite a bit. So this is an effort to try to attack that part of American hegemony. And then the final part of this is just get Iran to improve their human rights. It's an argument that Iran has human rights abuses that they suffer from, or that they engage in significant abuses of their population, and that they're non-democratic. They have elections, but the vast majority, since the critical decisions are made by the Ayatollah. So this is an effort to try to get them to democratize and improve their human rights. So for all of these different reasons, not all of them involving territorial dispute, the United States has imposed sanctions in an effort to try to change Iran's domestic and foreign policy behavior. So we can think about sanctions on other types of states in this way, right? So right now, presently, the United States maintains sanctions on North Korea, not necessarily to destabilize North Korea, but to try to contain North Korea's development of its weapons programs. So that's not it's a military behavior, but it's not something that involves military force right now, right? It's something that's intended to try to curtail one of North Korea's foreign policy objectives. So we can see some other cases of this. Particularly, we could see sanctions against American allies. So in the 1970s, the Carter administration imposed sanctions against several Latin American states, many of whom were American allies, to try to get them to improve their human rights, right? Many of these states were engaging in human rights abuses. And so the effort was try to punish them with sanctions so they would change their human rights behavior and improve their human rights behavior. And the same thing we can see in the 1980s, where the United States sanctioned South Africa, which was a key partner for the United States in Southern Africa in terms of containing communism. The United States imposed sanctions on them in the mid-1980s to try to get them to change their apartheid policies, which were policies that were discriminatory against the majority Black population in favor of the minority white population. And then finally, a famous example of this was in the 1990s. The United States had sanctioned Iraq for basically an entire decade, initially as punishment for Iraq's invasion of Kuwait and to compel Iraq to leave Kuwait, but eventually to curtail his weapons of mass destruction program and to get him to improve his human rights. So sanctions, again, are something that's used not just for military behaviors, but also to try to change domestic policy within the states, and they can be against both adversaries and states that are more aligned with the United States. It's a tool that's used, it's something short of war that the United States can use to try to course change and to exert power over several of these states. So I think one thing we can think about is what exactly are sanctions, right? When we think about sanctions, one way to conceptualize them is that they're something economic that imposes costs on the target state. So it's really easy to make an analogy to war. I happen to think, as someone that's researched sanctions quite a bit, that this is a poor analogy. But let's define what exactly sanctions do. Sanctions are actions that are taken by one or more countries. They can be multilateral. Multiple states can coordinate on that to impose sanctions. The countries that impose sanctions are known as the sender or senders in multilateral cases. The country that receives sanctions is known as the target. So what happens here is that one or more countries limit or end their economic relations with the target in order to persuade the country to change its policies. So there's a couple of features we're talking about with that. Sanctions are intended to be a form of coercion. We typically, meaning my colleagues and I, don't consider sanctions to be a sanction if they're just imposed as like a tariff or something like that. That's just basically for domestic consumption. We consider sanctions something that's done as an if-then statement. Sanctions are imposed if a particular behavior is observed. They will be reversed if that particular behavior changes. So by definition, a sanction has to involve one or more sender states. It has to be implemented by the sender in an effort to change some behavior of the target state. That could be contain its military behavior, that could be change its regime, that could be change a particular practice, that could be improve human rights, that could be an effort to get them to stop weapons proliferation or programs to develop weapons of mass destruction. Whatever it may be, it has to be something that's intended to change the behavior of the target state. Now, sanctions actually are, again, they're not something that's initiated by a military. What they are laws, right? They're basically just laws that a government passes. The law tries to impede economic exchanges between senders, individuals, and firms and their counterparts in the target. So the way this might work, for example, is that when we think about US sanctions on Cuba, the United States it basically imposed a fine on any individual or firm that did business with Cuba or visited Cuba. So when we think about who pays the cost of sanctions, it's not necessarily the target state directly, it's Americans, right? Americans pay a fine if they do business with Cuba, if they do business with Iran, if they do business with North Korea, they would pay some monetary punishment. Sometimes that punishment can be escalated to jail time, right? But really, again, what sanctions are intended to do is to hurt Americans that continue to do business with these states that are identified as target states. The one area where the US government has explicit control over sanctions is when there are cuts to military aid or something like that. That's when the US can do it directly. But for the most part, what sanctions are doing are impeding economic exchanges between Americans and the target state. So that's what they are, right? They're basically laws that punish Americans if they continue to do business with the target state, with the exception of cuts to military aid. So a question might be, do sanctions work? The overwhelming assessment is that sanctions don't work. But interestingly, in recent years, it seems like sanctions have been more effective. If you look at the Iran sanctions as an example of that. But for the most part, when we look at how sanctions have been examined for several decades, the belief, which has been persistent, is that economic sanctions do more harm than good. And as a result, sanctions are seen as counterproductive. So early studies of sanctions were done by three researchers named Hufbauer, Schott, and Elliott. They examined all cases where sanctions were imposed, and they found that at best, sanctions had about a 30% chance of success. And that, according to them, was poor. But what I would tell you, again, it's true with everything, is relative to what, right? If you're a batter, right? If you play baseball and you're a batter and you're batting 300, you're doing pretty good, right? And so you compare that to the success of war, which we don't have a good estimate of, right? Because war is chaotic and dynamic and fluid. So if you say it produces success only 30% of the time, it doesn't produce success 100% of the time, but it produces some success, right? So you have to think of it relatively. But having said that, most accounts of sanctions relied on an examination of maybe one or two cases. So if we look at the Cuban embargo as an example of that, that's a case where it seems like sanctions failed. They were initially imposed to destabilize Fidel Castro. 50 years went by, and Fidel Castro's regime stayed in power, continues to remain in power even though Fidel Castro is gone. So the argument there is that sanctions failed. That was a motivation for the Obama administration to remove those sanctions or relax those sanctions. The Trump administration is considering reimposing them. And another case of this is sanctions on Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Those were looked at as a failure because what they seem to be doing is not destabilizing Saddam Hussein, but instead harming the Iraqi population. Poverty rates were going up, child mortality was going up, etc. And the Iraqi economy just came to a crash as a result of these sanctions. But Saddam stayed in power. So that was looked at as a counterproductive effect of sanctions, and it looked like the policy wasn't working very well. Now, let's think about this a bit more carefully, right? Based on the cases where we observe sanctions, sanctions don't seem to be working. But the early studies were only examining A, high-profile cases, and B, cases where sanctions were actually imposed. But let's think about that strategically, as we did with war, right? If a leader believed that they would face sanctions and they still engage in the behavior that is looked at as offensive by the United States. So, for example, if Saddam Hussein believed he would be sanctioned but continued to oppose weapons inspectors, right? If the Iranians believed there would be sanctions but continued to engage in destabilizing activity throughout the Middle East, or if North Korea believed it would be sanctions but continued its weapons program, they probably already had an expectation that they could weather the costs of sanctions, right? If they believe there are going to be sanctions and continue to engage in aggressive behavior, the actual imposition of sanctions is not going to change their behavior very much. Just think today, are sanctions on Iran really going to change their behavior? They expect sanctions, right? And they expect sanctions for a whole bunch of different reasons. the Trump administration routinely escalates sanctions against them, and you can ask yourself, how many more sanctions are there to impose? Probably the same thing's true with North Korea. So right now, if there's an expectation that sanctions are going to be imposed and we still see the offensive behavior, that's not likely to produce success. But let's think about it a little bit differently. If there was a state that knew that a particular behavior was going to provoke sanctions, and if they were afraid of the consequence, the threat of sanctions may be effective. One really famous example of this was since the creation of Israel, many of the Arab states threatened other states with sanctions. So if they chose to invest in Israel and do business in Israel, they would face what was known as the Arab boycott of Israel, where all the Arab states would align and stop them from doing business in the Arab states. That stopped many firms and many firms of different nationalities, including American firms, from investing in Israel. That's a case where sanctions are actually working, right? But you don't see those sanctions imposed. You see the threat of those sanctions. Think about it this way. How many countries are routinely detonating nuclear weapons? Why don't they do that? Well, one explanation is they may not want to. Another explanation is that if they do, they know that they're likely to face American sanctions. And since they know that, why detonate the weapon? Why put yourself in a position where you're going to face harm by the United States? So if that's true, the threat of sanctions may actually be effective. But once the behavior is observed, the imposition is not going to be effective. But in order for the threat to be effective, the United States has to be able to impose these things. So it makes sense strategically for the United States to impose these in cases, even when you observe the offensive behavior, in order to support other countries responding to the threat, if that makes sense. So in order for the threat to be effective, the United States has to impose these things, even though imposition is not going to work a whole lot. But that will make the threat work, and that will in effect create some effectiveness for sanctions, right? So sanctions we do observe are less likely to succeed, but those support the threat, right? So we observe impositions in cases that are the least likely to succeed, but that's necessary to support success in the cases that we don't observe. So what that means is that sanctions are exerting power typically when you don't observe them imposed. The threat of sanctions actually works. Now, this was theoretical progress, thinking through sanctions this way, because we were only focusing on the cases where there was imposition. But we didn't have data to test these ideas. We didn't have data to test these propositions, right? Because we only had data on the cases where sanctions were imposed, and those data suffered from selection bias, right? So the case of imposition meant that the targets expected sanctions but still chose to engage in the offensive behavior. And if that's true, sanctions shouldn't be expected to work a whole lot. And consistently, as we developed theory in terms of sanctions, the argument was that the data we were using suffered from selection bias, because sanctions would be effective when threatened, but less effective when imposed. So this led to the creation of the data set that's on my website, which is the Threat and Imposition of Economic Sanctions data. These data were the brainchild of my academic advisor, my PhD supervisor, who was named Cliff Morgan at Rice University. When I was a graduate student there, that's when we began to work on these data. That's when I began to work on collecting these data. We've collected these data. We continue to collect these data. These data are continuing to tell us a whole bunch of interesting things about sanctions. So we piloted the threat of and imposition of sanctions data, the TIES data. The original data collection went from 1971 to 2000. The purpose of this was to identify all cases where sanctions were both threatened and imposed, right? So we were adding the cases where sanctions were threatened to the cases where they were imposed. We also added a whole bunch of more sanctions into the data. So we didn't just focus on the high profile cases, we focused on every case we could identify. So there's cases that are very, very low that are related to only economic disputes. There are cases that are significant, like the Cuban embargo and Saddam Hussein. So there's all sorts of different sanctions in that data set. And we later expanded it to 1945 to 2005, which is where it currently is. And so the website is right there if you're interested in taking a look at the sanctions data. So let me give you a couple of descriptive patterns that we have about sanctions from these data. If you look at the frequency of imposition, you can see that typically there were somewhere about around 50 sanctions per year beginning in 1945, and that stayed pretty consistent until the mid-1970s. At about 1975, you start to see this exponential increase in the usage of sanctions. Overwhelmingly, this is an American activity. 48% of sanctions in this period are done by the United States. The next largest user of sanctions is Canada, which is, I believe, at about 7%, right? So overwhelmingly, sanctions are an American activity. That's something to pay attention to. And if that's the case, the use of sanctions really seemed to escalate in the late 1980s. The 1990s is known as the sanctioning decade. They've gone down slightly in the 2000s, but they're still fairly high. They're being used more since quite often, right? That's often a tool that's used by the United States. And we can see that exponential pattern. So in total, we identified 1,420 cases in this period where sanctions were either threatened or imposed. We have 845 cases of imposition, which are 60% of the cases, and 567 cases where there are threats only, which are 40%. Now that's significant because we can see that there's a pretty good chunk of cases, 40% of the data, where sanctions are only threatened and not imposed, right? So that phenomenon where sanctions are just threatened and we never see imposition, but the threats either work or don't, that actually is a significant phenomenon that we identify in the data. Again, this is primarily an American activity. The US is the primary center of sanctions in 48% of the cases, followed by Canada at 7.9%. The UK and Russia are tied at 2.7%, and India is next at 2.4%. What we can also identify is that the European Union collectively also uses sanctions quite a bit. Our key state that we identify there is we identify the European Union as a sender. And the European Union collectively does impose quite a few sanctions as well, though nowhere near as many as the United States. So let's take a look at success. Depending on how we identify success, we see different success rates. If we're very restrictive, like Hofbauer, Schott, and Elliott were, and say sanctions are only cases where we see the target actually acquiesce and change its behavior, we see about 27% success if we remove cases where we can't identify the final outcome. If we remove the cases where we can identify the final outcome, we see that sanctions in those circumstances are about 38% effective. If we relax our definition of success and we allow for sanctions as part of negotiated settlements to be counted as success, where they're not absolute, like Hofbauer, Schott, and Elliott wanted, if we say, okay, let's suppose sanctions are part of a negotiation where the sender gives something, the target gives something, then sanctions are actually more effective, about 41% effective in cases where the final outcome is in the data, and 56% in cases where the final outcome is removed. Now, I want you to think about the statistic, right? We're sort of pushing up to, half the time sanctions are working if you consider negotiation to be success, right? So if you relax your definition of success, we would expect that we would see more successes, but we're seeing a lot more successes if you consider sanctions successful as part of a negotiated settlement. And finally, if we use a different definition of success, which is just a qualitative estimate as to who did better in the dispute, sanctions succeed about 32% of the time when the final outcome is considered failure, and 44% of the time when the final outcome is removed. So what we can see is that we're not as pessimistic, I would say, as Hofbauer, Schott, and Elliott were. We're identifying higher success rates, but it's not that far off unless we really start to relax our definition. If we look at the duration of sanctions, you can see that for the most part, sanctions are over fairly early, then most sanctions are imposed and then end, or most threats are imposed or created, issued, and then end. We see a decline in the frequency of duration as we move forward. The vast majority of these are over by 5,000 days, right? But most of them are over far earlier than that. Like I think if we look at their estimate of sanctions, how long they typically last, most disputes only last a few years, if that, right? So most of them occur and then they're gone. We can see some of them, like the case of the Cuban embargo, that go on for a long time. What happens in a lot of cases is that sanctions threats may be issued and everyone forgets about them, or sanctions may be imposed and the target alters its behavior, or sanctions may be imposed and the target just doesn't do anything and the world continues on. And at some point, people just even stop paying attention to the fact that they're there. So what we can also look at, if we look at the types of sanctions, is we can see increasingly the number of sanctions are going up. but the number of security cases are going up. So we divided these into cases that are focusing on trade and other sorts of economic issues. We divided into security-related sanctions. These are the non-trade cases, so there's security-related sanctions. So we can see that throughout the 1990s, these have steadily increased, fairly stable to 1990s. In the 1990s, they went up. Now, based on these data, we can actually identify several conditions that maximize the probability that sanctions work. We've never been a big fan of this idea that sanctions work. They work under some circumstances, they don't work under some other circumstances. So we can say there's some probability that sanctions may work, which we can maximize if there are certain characteristics of sanctions that are met. So the first thing that makes sanctions the most successful is that they're threatened, but they're not imposed. That's going to maximize your chance of success. If they are imposed, what maximizes the chance of success is that they're multilateral, but preferably through an international institution like the UN, like NATO, like the European Union, whatever it might be. But UN sanctions tend to be the best here. The third is that they're costly to the target. They impose significant costs on the target, but they're not as painful for the sender. So for example, the Arab embargo was very painful for the senders as well, right? So that's one that's not likely to work, but ones that are costly to the target, but not the sender, those are more likely to work. Fourth, they're also imposed in conjunction with other coercive measures. So if you impose sanctions and you use military force, they're more likely to succeed. Now, one thing we can do, and that we have done, is to try to separate. Was it the sanctions doing it? Was it the military force doing it? Oftentimes it's the military force doing it and they're imposed together, but the sanctions do facilitate the military effort, so sanctions are still considered successful in most cases. But if sanctions are also imposed with diplomatic sanctions, if economic sanctions are also imposed with diplomatic sanctions or a naming and shaming campaign, they are more likely to succeed. So sanctions are more likely to succeed when imposed in conjunction with other coercive measures. And finally, they're more likely to succeed if they're just enforced. It's really incredible how many times sanctions are not enforced, that sanctions are imposed, but really no one does anything about it if you break the law, right? So for example, at one point in time, if you went to Cuba in violation of the Cuban sanctions, the fine you would pay was something like $0, right? So it was nothing, right? So it was basically saying, hey, we really don't care about this, right? So what sanctions have to be in order for them to get them to work is there has to be some vigorous enforcement, which was certainly the case when you look at the Iran sanctions that brought Iran to the table. So those are the conditions under which sanctions are more likely to work. So I'm going to pause here, and when we come back, we'll start to talk about how exactly sanctions work and what exactly they're doing, and not think about these things in terms of war so much. Think about them as far as what are sanctions actually doing to produce coercion.